Welcome back to Python Scripting for GIS Applications. This is a class at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and it's spring semester. In this video session, I'm going to teach you how to use the insert cursor. And typically that's used to create standalone tables or feature classes. And you can use insert cursors in a standalone Python script totally outside of ArcGIS. But in this case, I'm going to show you inside ArcGIS because that way we can sort of get the usage of some of the commands in the help window in the Python window. So the first thing we're going to do is make a variable for a table. And I'll just call this testtable.dbf. And then we'll set our workspace variable. And since we're making a DBF table, the workspace will be a folder. And then we'll set our environment to that workspace. So arcpy environment.workspace is equal to some path. Okay, so then what we could do is use the create table geoprocessing tool to make an empty DBF table. So now we have an empty DBF table, and we could use the arcpy.getMessages to make sure that that was successful. So it did execute the geoprocessing tool create table at this path, and this was the name of our table that it created, and it successfully created that table. So everything's good up to this point. So the next step will add fields to this empty DBF table using the add field geoprocessing tool. So we'll add a field that will contain whole numbers as a short integer field. And I just arbitrarily name this int field is the name. And then we'll add a field to contain numbers with precision to the right of the decimal place, so double precision fields. And I arbitrarily name this double field. And then we'll add a field for text. And when you create a text field, you have to specify what's the maximum number of characters this text field can contain. So in this example, we're going to create a text field. It's going to contain up to 16 characters. And then we'll add a date field. So since we're working in a DBF table, we can't contain time in a date field, but we can contain years, months, and days in a date field. Okay, so now we've created these fields in this DBF table. We could loop through those fields and look at the name and the type. So we'll make a list of fields using the arcpy list fields command. And then the name of the table that we're going to work with is test table. So once we have our list of fields, then we can loop through them. So for a field in our list of fields, print field.name and field.type. So then it prints the fields that were created in addition to the object ID field, and a field 1 was created. Okay, so the insert cursor will now allow us to specify field values for any row that we create in this DBF table. So the first thing we'll do is we'll create a cursor called table rows, and that's using the data access module and then the insert cursor, the name of our DBF table, and then this asterisk means we're going to work with all the fields that currently exist in this DBF table. Okay, so then what we'll do is we'll make a list of values for our table. So the values have to correspond with the object ID, field 1, integer field, double field, text field, and date field. So our first row would have an object ID of 0, field 1 of 1. We need another value for our integer field, so I'll call that 100. And then our float field or double precision field will be 0.33. Our text field will be test.text, and then the date field will be this date. So I need to import the date time module before I can do this. So what I'll do is I'll just copy this and then import date time, and then I'll paste it. Okay, so that should create a list of values that we can use as the first row in our DBF table. So we'll look at it. So that's what's in our list of values right now. So then we'll go back to our cursor, so that was table rows, and then dot insert a row. So we'll insert the row, and that's going to be our list of values. So that inserted the first row in our DBF table. And then we could just change our list of values. So I press the up arrow key. So the object ID in this case will be 1, and the next ID will be 2, and we'll change this to 200, and we'll change this to 66, and we'll call this test 2, and we'll make this April. And then we'll simply insert this new list of values in our table. And you can continue so on. So in this case, we'd have 2 rows. So I'll unlock my table objects. If I say delete table rows, that unlocks my table. And I might as well delete my list of values just to clean things up. And I'll delete my list of fields. Okay, so then we could look at that table in Arc. Okay, so here's our table in ArcMap, and here's the first row we created. So field 1 value of 100 all the way through a date field value of March 22nd, 2013, and then the last row we created. So that's how you can create tables using Arcpy. You can do it either in the Python window, or you can do it as a standalone Python script, where in your standalone Python script, the first thing you would do is import space Arcpy to import the Arcpy module. Okay, so in the previous example, we output to a DBF table in a folder. You can also output to geodatabases. So in the second example, what we'll do is we'll create a point feature class inside a file geodatabase. So the first thing I'll do is establish my workspace, and then I'll make a variable from that workspace, which is this geodatabase. So my path is equal to this geodatabase container. Okay, so then what we'll do is we'll use the create feature class tool to create a point feature class, and I'll just name it test points. So create feature class management, a geodatabase container, and then the name of my new feature class will be called test points. And then the keyword points, which specifies what the geometry type of this feature class will be. So that creates an empty point feature class in the geodata. And then what we'll do is use the add field tool to add a field called point ID to my test points feature class. Okay, so now I've got an existing point feature class that has no rows, but it has a field called point ID. So the next step will be to create an insert cursor from the data access module. And what we do is say we're going to make an insert cursor on our existing point feature class. And these are the 2 fields we're going to put in our new point feature class. So the point ID, and then we'll also specify the point XY coordinates. Okay, so then what we can do is we'll create a row or a point feature. So we're going to insert our point ID, and we're going to insert the XY coordinates for the point. And then we could do the same thing for our next row. So that will be point ID 101. And we'll put that at 0.0 in the X and 10 in the Y. And then we could repeat that. So the next one will be ID 102, and we'll put that at an X of 10 and a Y of 10. And then finally, we could put in point 103 for its ID, and we'll put that at a coordinate X of 10 and Y of 0. So that inserts 4 features in our point feature class, or in other words, 4 rows in our point attribute table. So then we can delete our point rows to unlock that table, and then we can look at these points in ArcMap. So then in ArcMap, indeed, we do have 4 points that were created, and we, in our Python script, establish what the values should be for this field, and then we can look at spatially where these points are located by first labeling the points. So if I go to labels, so label the points using the point ID field. So here are 4 points where this point is coordinates 0, 0. This point is an X of 10, a Y of 0. This point is an X of 10, a Y of 10. And this point is an X of 0 and a Y of 10. We can also use the insert cursor to create a line feature class. So in this case, I'm also going to output to that test file geodatabase. So the first thing we'll do is we'll use the create feature class tool. We'll create a feature class named test lines, and then the keyword polyline to specify the geometry type of this feature class. And then just like before, we can use the add field tool. So we'll add a field for our line ID in this polyline feature class. So I'll call this line ID will be the name of my field, and it'll be short integer. So that adds a field to test lines. Okay, so what we want to do is make a line, and in order to make a line object, basically you're going to have vertices that define the line. So those vertices are points. So what we could do is make a line array, which is essentially a list of points defining our line. So in this case, I'll just make a 2-point line. So going from 0, 0 to 0, 10, and that's going to be an Arcpy array object. So then after you have a list of points the line is composed of, then you can use the Arcpy polyline function to actually create the line. So then we'd say, okay, this is going to be equal to Arcpy polyline. So take this container that has the vertices and make a line object from it. So now if I typed in polyline, it's a line object. So if I press dot, for example, I could say, well, export that to a well-known text. And that's what is in this well-known text, that it's a line string going from 0, 0 to 0, 10. Okay, so now we've got our line object, so then we can use that to actually create the line in our feature class. So what we'll do is make our insert cursor, where we're going to insert this field value for line ID and then the shape of the line. Okay, and then we'll say, let's say our line ID is equal to 1, and then we would just say line rows dot insert a row, and then we're going to insert our values. So our first field will be the line ID value, and that will be, in this case, I will just insert whatever is in this variable called ID. And then the second thing is our object that is the line object. So that's our polyline object. Okay, so I just misspelled that. So it should be lowercase I right here. Okay, so that created the first line in our line feature class. So then we could basically repeat it and say, okay, now we'll make for line 2, we'll give it an ID value of 2, and we'll change the vertices. So our second line will go from 0, 10 to 10, 10 in the XY coordinates. And then we simply insert that into our row. So the ID should be 2, and the second line will go from X of 0, 10 to an XY of 10, 10. And then we're done, so then we can delete our line rows object to unlock that table. And then we could also delete our line array object just to clean things up. Okay, so then we can look at these two test lines in ArcMap. Okay, so in this case, I gave the two test lines identical coordinates. So if I go to the attribute table, here's my first test line, and it's going from 0, 0 to 0, 10, 10. And then my next one is from 0, 10 to 10, 10. And then this second line is also going from an x of 0, 10, xy of 0, 10 to an xy of 10, 10. So in this case, we've basically got two lines. They've got duplicate geometries, identical coordinates. Okay, and can create Polygon feature classes. So I'll do this in my file Geodatabase. So the first thing I'll do is create a feature class called test polygon, and then I'll add a field, and I'll call that field polyid. So now we've got an empty Polygon feature class in our file Geodatabase, and it's got one field called polyid. So then what we need to do is create vertices that define our polygon. So what I'll do is I'll make an empty array object called polygon vertices. And then we'll add our vertices to this container. So we'll start at coordinate 0, 0, and that will be the first vertex in our container. And then we'll go from 0, 0 to 10, 10. And then we'll go from 10, 0 to 10, 10. I'll change that to a 10. And then we'll go from 10, 10 to 0, 10. And then the last thing we want to do is close our polygon. So we want to end vertex at the same as our beginning vertex. So now we've got this container that's an array, an Arcpy array called polyvertices. So we could look at that. So we could say, let's loop through every point in that container. So for point in polyvertices, print point.x, point.y. So that's what's in the container now. So we're going to be in the lower left-hand corner at 0, 0, move over to the right to an x of 10, then move up to x of 10, y of 10, and then move left to 0x 10 of y, and then return. My ending vertex is the same as my beginning vertex. Okay, so then we can create a polygon object from this container. So that would be the arcpy.polygon function. So now I've got a polygon object that is this myPoly. So then that's what we can write to our polygon feature class as its geometry. So then we can create a insert cursor. So just like when we work with our lines and points, we'll make our insert cursor. We're going to insert into this empty polygon feature class the field value for polyid and then the polygon shape. So let's say our polygon ID will be equal to 100. So then what we could do is polyrows dot insert our row and then the values. So the first thing is our field value for polyid. So that's going to be this variable ID, and then the second thing is the shape itself, which is myPoly. So that inserted the first row in this polygon feature class. So we can delete our polyrows to unlock it, and we can delete vertices. So here's our polygon, and we defined it as starting at 0, 0, going over 10, 0, going up to 10, 10, going over to 0, 10, and then closing at 0, 0. Okay, so for our next session, your assignment is to create point feature class in a file Geodatabase, and it should contain 100 random points. And these 100 random points should range in values in the x from values ranging from -147 to -148. So that would be a typical longitude around Fairbanks, Alaska. And in the Y ranging from 64 degrees to 65 degrees. So that would be the latitude around Fairbanks, Alaska. And I'll go over the solution to that Arcpy script at the beginning of our next video session.